When I came to Russia, all my references were books. In England, for some reason, you read enormous quantities of Russian. So I read, lots of Tolstoy, Gogol, Turgenev. It's a bit like, as a photojournalist, if you don't do war photography, you're not a real photojournalist. And if you don't read Russian literature, then you're not a real appreciator of literature, because Russian literature is such a... Yeah, so I caught the end of it, but we were very curious about what this was. We didn't know. So that's why, another reason why, I think I felt interested by the mosaics is that they were telling me something about the Soviet Union. We were all very, very curious about the Soviet Union, what that was, okay? In fact, the BBC just did a series on Russia, the radio, and they were interviewing me about this. I first took a camera really when I traveled in the US when I left school. And I had a camera of my father, it was an Agfa, and it had 3 settings. You had close-up, slightly further away, and then you had these little mountains on there, which I meant for distance pictures. The pictures were terrible, of course, but I loved this tactile feeling that you have when you work with cameras, about the lenses and just there's something about the physical feel. So the camera to me had this feel which I really loved. I grew up in England and I studied at Oxford, and I had a job lined up in a bank when I finished my studies. And I didn't fancy that very much. So I traveled for a year, actually in Australia, New Zealand, and Asia, and I came back. And that's when I took my first real pictures, I would say, traveling after university. And then before I then went to do photojournalism college. And my father very much hoped that I would take up a real job, become a lawyer or something. But I decided, in fact, to try my hand at photography. I became a photojournalist, I would say. It was really something of, it was a wish, almost an accident. And I remember I told a friend of mine that I wanted to become a photojournalist, and he said, and next week you're going to be an astronaut, James, right? So I'm not sure I really believed very much that I was going to become a photojournalist. So I spent a year in London at a place called the London College of Printing. When I finished, I desperately wanted to go to Russia. And then when I left London in 1991, I had 30 rolls of film from the London Times and not much else. And I was lucky because I went to the former Soviet Union, and that was a huge story. People were very hungry. When I say people, people in the West, newspapers, magazines were very hungry for that story. And I spent 4 years working as freelance in Ukraine, in Russia, traveling all over the Caucasus, Central Asia, and in basically everywhere. And then 4 years later, I started working for the New York Times, and they brought me to Moscow. When my sort of real time in Russia started. Very quickly, I ended up covering a conflict. I was in Karabakh in February 1992. I went with a journalist who was working for an English newspaper, and I was completely unprepared for covering a conflict. I mean, not in the physical sense that I didn't have the flak jacket, I didn't have the equipment that you're supposed to carry in a war zone. It wasn't that, it was emotionally, I was completely unprepared for it. And that was a very important moment because it's the power of the emotions that you sense, and also the pain, I guess. It's like you feel very close to a story. In other words, when you see something in a newspaper, you see it on the TV show, there's always this distance. You're trying to imagine what something is like. And I guess that when you go to a war zone, what I really felt was being just separated by the tiniest of distance from the story and for the people that I was photographing. And you can see how photographers get addicted is maybe a strong word, how they get drawn into doing conflict photography. Because there is something that is so raw about it that you get drawn into it. And that was the moment that really I felt I had to go and see more. Coming back to, of course, what people give you awards for is almost always work that's connected to conflict. Because those are the images that end up coming on the front pages. Those are the images which strike fear, pain, is they generate the emotions in the viewers. And people know how complicated it is for photographers to go and take those pictures. So, for instance, I won a Pulitzer for my work in Afghanistan. I spent 3.5 months in Afghanistan in 2001, and that was the first digital war. That was, in a way, the most interesting aspect of that, is that I literally was given my first digital camera when, a week before I got on a plane and went to Afghanistan, and I'm trying to figure out how this camera works. I mean, in principle, it's the same thing, but it was completely new at the time. But having the digital camera meant that I was able to send pictures every single day from the middle of nowhere in Afghanistan. And those pictures were on the front pages day after day after day of the New York Times, Paris Match, and Time Magazine. They were absolutely everywhere. And that story meant a lot to me because it was like the story in the way that really made my name. Also, my poor wife at the time found out she was pregnant 2 weeks after I got into Afghanistan, and it wasn't a weight, but it meant to me that if I was risking my life in this place, then I had to make it worthwhile. In other words, the work I had to do had to really mean something. And that's, I think, is also one of the reasons why I got awards for that work in Afghanistan, because I said, if I'm here every day, and every day is a risk in Afghanistan, I felt like I have to make this work. I have to make these pictures mean something that people will connect to. I also won awards for work from the war in Iraq in 2003, but perhaps the work that's won the most awards was the work from Beslan in 2004. Now, the Beslan story is very particular. When the Beslan event happened on the 1st of September 2004, I was actually in France. And I came 3 days later to Moscow. And I was on a plane flying down to Beslan, which is the airport of Vladikavkaz, when the special forces tried to retake the school. So instead of landing in Beslan, the plane I was on, it flew to Milorany Vody, and I arrived that night. So I missed the whole event of that day. And the next morning, I remember going out to the morgues in Vladikavkaz and seeing all these dead children just lying there, like a field of them. And I had 2 kids at this point, and I found it very hard to look at. And really, Beslan, in a way, it broke my desire to continue working in conflict photography. But at the same time, I felt there was something very important to say, that what was going on and what had happened in Beslan. So I went back 2 weeks later when officially the school had restarted. So all the kids who had survived who'd been in school number 1, they went to school number 6. And this is, of course, interesting is that supposedly, officially, life had restarted. But of course, the pain that was there in the city was, you could literally touch it. Another project that I did in Russia, which meant a lot to me, was a project called Dien Pobyedy. Because my father had been in the military, and he'd been in the parachute regiment. He'd also been in a special forces unit, and he refused to talk about what he'd seen, what he'd done. And so what I saw in my father, I saw a little bit in the veterans of the war, from World War II. And so I went 1 year in 2006, and I decided just to photograph the women, because I felt that one always saw these images of the men, these very handsome men, the sailors from the Baltijski Fleet or the Severny Fleet or wherever, and all these colonels with all the medals and everything. And I thought, well, I know that picture. I want to see something that's a little bit different. So I tried to photograph just the women. And most of the women have been radio operators or nurses, though some also, I even found one sniper. And anyway, so I photographed them, and I went to Gorky Park, and I set up right at the entrance a studio. Like I put a big white sheet on the gate to the side, and to convince the veterans to let me take their picture, I gave everyone a Polaroid. Because I'd always ask, а когда будет фотография? And I go, no, сразу же. Тут же, да, тут же. And so I would give them the picture, because you know the promise of a photographer is worth nothing. So when the photographer says to you, I'll send you the picture later, you can like, yeah, forget about that. So I had the little Polaroid, so I would take the picture, and it was on a Hasselblad. So, and then I'd take the picture, and it'd come out the front. Those Polaroids come out the front, and I'd give it to them. And what was interesting was that, of course, it takes a little time for the Polaroid to appear. So they'd be looking at this, and of course, some of these people were 80 or 90, and of course they couldn't really see, and they look at it and go like, you know, где же фотография? And it's like, I said, сейчас будет. And so they were waiting for it. And then, of course, they were very happy because, you know, they understood that I was actually being truthful for once. And anyway, I saw these amazing sailors and army and then Air Force men, and I thought, okay, so I have to come back next year. And so I came back 4 years in a row, and 2006, 7, 8, and 9, and I photographed over 500 veterans. And then the British government paid for a book called День Победы. And that won, the book won an award called the Книга года from the International Book Festival. And it was a big show in Moscow at the Museum of Modern Art of Moscow. So there's lots of different awards for very different kinds of pictures. But interesting enough, nearly all the awards have been connected to moments of conflict in one way or another, either conflict as it happened or the aftermath of that conflict. The День Победы project was something that I felt was important to do because I had stopped doing the war photography. So I myself was trying to digest my feelings about no longer doing that. And so I was curious about these veterans who had been in the war and were no longer, and how they were living with those emotions. I lived 20 years in Russia, and I spent 20 years in Moscow, and my wife spent 24 years in Moscow. This is a city where our children grew up. It's a place where our dog, Cookie, comes from. And it's a place which I have a lot of affection for. And I spent a lot of very happy years in Moscow. And so this is a project which I wanted to take with me from that city, that would remind me always of walking down, you know, being in the metro, walking down the streets. And that's the thing about the mosaics, is they're everywhere in that city. So it's like when I look at the pictures of the mosaics, I'm visualizing my time being, you know, on my way to Ismailsky Park. And the children would go crazy when I say, oh, look, there's some really great mosaics here. Okay, do you mind if we stop for a minute and I take some more pictures of this one? Oh, Dad, it's like, you know. And so it's like finding old friends, you know, it's like going someplace, you know, they're like old friends to me. It's like, yeah. When you go down Ismailsky Chaussee, there's this one on the left, and then there was this famous institute, and there's one on the wall. And so they're like having, you know, they're like my old friends scattered across the city. And so that's it. It's like, it's the way of taking a little bit of Moscow with me, now that I'm no longer there. There was something in these mosaics that spoke to me. I fell in love with the brightness of these colors. I mean, obviously we all know where a lot of the mosaics are. So you go to Mayakovsky Station, in all the metros, there's some which are visible in very public places. And what was interesting was trying to find where the other ones were. And so that's why it was great to have the help of Zhenya Kudelina. She's extraordinarily thorough and determined, and yet it's not an answer which she accepts. And so she got on the case of finding mosaics and of looking across the internet and sending out questions and tracking down places where they maybe were forgotten sports centers or forgotten dvoreць kultury of some factory, some former, you know, some business center now, but which had been once upon a time some other, you know, Soviet center. And as I was saying, people today don't not so many people see mosaics. The younger generation has a harder time seeing them because they don't have the cultural references. I once went to the Institut Fizikultury in Izmailova, and I was trying to find this very famous mosaic, which is 30 meters long, of the Estafeta. And I asked a student coming out of the entrance, I said, so where's the famous mosaic? And he goes like, oh, we don't have any mosaics here. And I go, okay. And then when I go around the corner, and there it is, 30 meters. And I go like, well, hang on. What do you mean no mosaics here? And that was actually one of those pleasures. I traveled all over Moscow, all these sort of parts of Moscow, which as a sort of, say, a foreigner living on Nikitskaya, you don't necessarily go to see. So it was also a great way of discovering the city. The Nekem mosaics in the Mayakovsky station are, to me, the most fabulous mosaics. And I think what is interesting about these mosaics is that, first off, Dineka is just an extraordinary artist. And you can see the imagination that this man had and the way he translated it into mosaics. And these were the first ones. And it's always curious to see the pioneers. I mean, of course, pioneer is a big word in Russian, but you know, Dineka was really the pioneer here. He was the one who imagined this. And what is also extraordinary about these mosaics is that they were done with Frolov, who had the famous mosaic workshop in St. Petersburg that had made the mosaics for the churches in the Tsarist era. So the pieces of mosaic that he used for making these mosaics, they were from the very best quality pieces. And they have the most deeply saturated colors. And so that's why today, almost 100 years after these mosaics were made, they still have this extraordinary depth and richness of color. They look like they were made last week. What I liked about these mosaics in particular is that they're all along the main hall of the metro station, but you can only see a couple at a time, and you have to move your neck like this, like you're staring into the sky. And also a lot of the mosaics themselves, you have like divers, or you have planes, or you have parachutists. So also you have scenes which have the sky. And I just liked also this idea of sort of being underground in the metro and looking up and seeing the sky. And so again, it's the imagination of Dineka, which is, I find, just an extraordinary vision, combined with the virtuoso technique of Frolov, the master mosaic maker. And so to me, the Mayakovsky station, you really have the most fabulous mosaics. What is interesting, of course, about the mosaics in general is that they vary enormous in terms of size, of quality, and when I mean quality, both the physical quality of the mosaics and also the quality of the artistic design. The ones I like the most are, I love the cosmonaut ones. I've been to Baikonur, and I'd also been to Zvezdny Gorodok twice, and I've been to Baikonur twice. And for me, I have no desire to travel to space, but I'm extraordinarily in awe and amazement at people who want to go to space. There's this Besetka, which unfortunately you can't get to anymore, but you can see where Gagarin went the night before he went into space, because obviously he wasn't sure he was going to come back alive. And apparently he sat in this Besetka on the banks of the Amudarya, and he's thinking about life and everything. And the other interesting thing is that, so apparently when you walked to the rocket, to the Soyuz, they come out of the bus, they walk. Apparently it's a place he stopped, to go to the loo, right on the side of the road. And apparently all the cosmonauts and astronauts, they all stop on the side of the road because they like to do like what Gagarin did. So I just find, the bravery of this man and all the other ones who have followed him. I'm just in complete awe of this bravery. And what is interesting in the cosmonauts that you have, so you have there's one, for instance, at the meteorological center, and he's sort of flying parallel. So he's a bit like Leonov, the first guy who walked into space, and he's sort of like hanging on like this. And then you have one that's on the Warszawskie Chaussee, and that's a very big one like this, and he's sort of very handsome. And then there's one that was in a bus station, which has been destroyed since, unfortunately, no longer exists. Mm-hmm. And he's a big blue cosmonaut, and he looks very melancholy. He's like sort of the Major Tom, if you want, of the Soviet mosaic cosmonauts. And so what I find is that interesting is that you have these different artists. They've been told, we need a cosmonaut here. They've all made different cosmonauts. And I find that very interesting. So in other words, even though these are not, you can't, it's not, you see the name very rarely underneath the mosaic, but at the same time you can feel the personality of the person who made them. So that's another thing that speaks to me with these mosaics, is that even though they're generally anonymous, or sometimes we know afterwards who made them, or we can find out, is that you can feel the personality of the artist coming through. So that's what I like. They were propaganda. They were not necessarily considered to be works of art, but nonetheless, to me, they are artistic creations, and they speak to me. The longest personal project that I worked on is the castle, which is about this oversized house that belongs to my wife, the Château de Maillebois. And it's an interesting story because the very first time I went to the castle was in 1999. And at that time, Sylvie's father, my wife, Sylvie's father, was living there by himself with his dog in this very large house. And Sylvie and I have been going out for a year and a half. And she said to me, do you ride? And I thought, what kind of a question is that for an Englishman? And I understood, of course, that it was an invitation to meet her father. And her father at that time was 86. And we went to a hunt, so a chasse à courre. And they hunt the roebuck in the woods. So we're on a horse, we had the dogs, we're chasing, and he was 86. So I thought, okay, well, this isn't going to last long. Anyway, he spent 6 hours on the horse, and I had to spend 6 hours on the horse too. And I hadn't ridden in about 5 years, and so I remember getting off and it was aching. But I fell in love with that place. I mean, of course, I love Sylvie more than the house, but I fell in love with this house. And the very first pictures that I took the very first day, they're in the book. And anyway, Sylvie and I got married, and then I gradually just collected images, because we were living in Russia, we weren't there very often. We were there on the holidays, and every year it was like a farmer. I'm planting seeds, I'm collecting, and also when you do a project, sometimes at the beginning you're not entirely sure where it's going. In other words, I'm not one of these sort of photographers who you choose an idea, you have and it's like you make a form. And like it's square, it's rectangular. You say, right, I have to make everything to fit into this. So I was just taking pictures, gathering, and I wanted to see what happened. And so I took pictures of the woods, I took pictures of dogs, I took pictures of people who were working there, I took pictures of hunters, I took pictures of everybody who seemed to sort of intersect in this strange place that shouldn't really exist anymore because it's a place that's from another time. And then, after 20 years, I couldn't take any more pictures. I know I felt like I'd lost sight. I'd become too close to it. I couldn't see it anymore. And when I did that, I went to see my German publisher, and we made this book. And it's an artistic impression. I mean, it's not something which is, it's an artistic impression, but probably in 30, 40, 50 years, it'll feel like a document, a journalistic document about a way of life which is disappearing. I'm curious about what a house that has existed for 600 years, what that gives you, what that means, what it means to the people who are there, how that affects the lives of the people who live in that place. It was a present to my wife. Okay, so if the mosaic project was a present to myself, castle was a present to my wife. Another project in Maillebois, but about the woods. It's really a completely artistic project. And I'm finding it more complicated to know exactly what I'm saying with this, where my voice is in this story. Because just taking pictures of plants and trees, it's okay, you can take pictures of plants and trees. It's not so simple to make something which speaks to other people. And you have very old trees in this forest. You have the oldest tree, which actually there's a picture in this book of my daughter. It's called the Shen. In fact, it's interesting, there's a map done of the park by Sylvie's great-grandfather in 1882. And there's one tree that is marked on the map. Only one in the entire forest of thousands of trees, called the Chêne Pommier. So even 140 years ago, this tree was already something special. So it's probably 350 years old, which is very old for an oak. There are really beautiful, beautiful trees in this. And there's even actually, we have an area where we have birch trees. I mean, it's known as La Petite Russie, the little Russia. And this thing about, in French, called un bouleau is the word for birch tree. And it grows on very poor ground. It doesn't need to have good earth. It grows where the stone's not good. So this has a lot of character in these woods, but capturing this character is not so simple. But this is my new
challenge
project. And I'm doing one project from the balcony of this terrace. I'm photographing the sky, the clouds, which maybe seems a little bit banal as a project, but I'm very interested by the perspective. We're on the fourth floor, or fifth floor in Russian terms, a perspective that you have at this height. And I remember when there was this book called The Shock of the New, written by Robert Hughes, the famous Australian artist, critic who worked for the art critic of Time magazine. And he was talking about the Eiffel Tower. And of course, the Eiffel Tower is a lot taller than this building. But he was talking about how the perspective was shocking to the Parisians and the people who came there. They'd never seen the world from that height. And so I'm curious about how the skyline looks from the fifth floor. And it really looks something completely different when you're just walking in the street. So I'm doing the clouds, and so it's going to be 31 pictures at one point, because we're number 31, Quai Anatole France. And so I'm trying to find 31 pictures showing the sky. Again, it'd be also, we won't live in this place forever. It'd be another way of remembering
saying thank you to this place.
Yeah, saying thank you to this amazing view over the Seine and over the city of Paris, even though we were not going to see the Seine or the city of Paris, but we're going to see the clouds. And then they'll force me to remember what was underneath them.